last year by a colleague in Cambridge, Nick Butterfield, that's done a lot of work on this late Precambrian interval. And why is it an important diagram? Well, I'll tell you. This is the whole sort of Precambrian interval that we've been talking about. And there's not a huge amount of evidence for a large variety, diversity of microbes. Perhaps there were, but we haven't found it. But the evidence suggests that there was a great deal of ecosystem stability. So in our microbial world, there weren't a lot of rapid changes taking place in ecological structures. And there was very low morphological disparity. So a lot of the organisms superficially looked the same. There weren't huge differences in what these different floras or bacteria or those sorts of things actually looked like. But once you come into this latest Precambrian interval, following Snowball Earth, things change because we have a very special and a very distinctive fauna, the Ediacara fauna here. And during this Ediacara interval, suddenly we get a step-like change, increase in morphological disparity. We get tremendous variations, well, certainly much greater variations than we've seen before in the morphologies of these different organisms. And allegedly then, the ecosystem stability that we've seen for billions of years actually crashes. And so we're into much less stable ecosystem structures that are changing rapidly all the time, and a very short term during the Phanerozoic. And these, I think, represent the 5 big extinction events here. And so during the big extinction events, we essentially get a drop in morphological disparity. Okay, a lot of things disappear, they go extinct. But also we get a sort of increase in ecosystem stability. And this is a little bit hard to understand, but I did actually ask Nick Butterfield what he meant by this. And what he really means is the return of this microbial world, which brings back the microbial type communities with their stability after some of these extinction events for a short interval of time. So in a way this sums up a lot of what I've been saying today of the stable and low diversity, low disparity ecosystem throughout the Precambrian. But where it really changes is now, right here in the Ediacara, and I'm going to use the last few minutes just to introduce the Ediacara fauna and say why it's so special. This is quite a familiar diagram, and this is taken from a number of different publications. And this fauna was first discovered in the late 1940s in the Flinders Ranges in South Australia by a mining geologist, Mr. Sprigg. And he's actually got this Sprigina named after him. But this gives you a sort of feeling of what these organisms are actually like. And there's quite a range of different morphologies. Here's a circular guy here. Here's a sort of sea pen-like thing here. This has got a little bit more detail around here. This appears to have a chamber. This appears to have a gut here. And this has got various ribs on. So the point there is that now we're moving into an interval with a lot more morphological disparity. Well, what are the key points about this Ediacara fauna? What makes it so special from everything else? Well, it's soft-bodied. As far as I know, none of these particular organisms have a sort of skeletal material hasn't actually been reported. There's a lot of them. We now have over 100 species of these types of organisms. it's got a very strange mode of preservation, and you might think, you know, being soft-bodied, these things would just disappear. But I think we have to remember that back in the late Precambrian, in the Ediacara, there weren't any scavengers about, there probably weren't any predators around, so once these organisms died, they just decayed on the seabed. They weren't eaten or scavenged by anything. And Jim Gehling and others have reported a very important process in which a lot of these Ediacara animals were imprinted on algal mats. And so, in fact, they're what they call death masks, sort of recorded as molds on these algal mats. Now, this type of preservation disappeared at the start of the Cambrian, when a lot of this algal material disappeared during what people call the Cambrian substrate revolution, when the algal mats were essentially eaten. And so they go. And so the possibility to preserve the Ediacara biota in this way really disappeared at the end of the Precambrian. So it may be also to do with preservation rather than a true extinction of these animals. The vast majority of them, virtually all of them, lack evidence of, for example, gut and limbs. So they didn't seem to have a major differentiation or lots of different tissue types or various types of organs and structures. So they tended to be rather simplistic looking organisms. And if we have a look at them, and these show them in different styles. There's some sort of radial ones, there's that sort of grew from the middle out, there's some bipolar ones that grew from the middle in two directions, and there's some sort of unipolar ones that started at one end and grew in that direction. But they tend to be rather flattened organisms with chambers developed, with rather high surface to volume ratios. And this is suggested to Dolph Seilacher and others that these things are quite different from true metazoans, that they lived by diffusion processes. Okay, so the actual nutrients weren't actually taken in through a mouth and digested like most metazoans, but in fact all these nutrients were diffused through the different chambers. Each of these sort of chambers would act as a sort of individual unit. And so therefore they're not metazoans in Seilacher's view. They're sort of large protozoans that have grown various modules. There are three main assemblages that we know. The Avalon type from Newfoundland and Canada, which is a very deep water type of assemblage, the classic white sea assemblage, and then the Namibian Nama assemblage, which is very shallow water. And so people can begin to see ecological communities within these Ediacara biotas. People have tried to look at the biogeography, but at the moment there isn't a good, robust biogeographical model to go with the distribution of these particular guys. But it's not that simple, because undoubtedly within the Ediacara fauna there are lurking around a few odd, strange things that are not the same as the Ediacara biota. And this has been debated a lot, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this next time when we talk about the origin of the metazoans. But this is an animal called Kimberella, and this is an impression of it here. And it's been described as many things, but most people now would consider it to be a type of mollusk, okay, a primitive mollusk. And that's on the basis that there are trace fossils associated with Kimberella, scratch marks, that look as if the animal had a radula, okay, this horny type mouth part, which would be associated with mollusks. So not everything at this particular time within the Ediacara biota are these rather strange pneumatic type organisms. Hidden away are a number of other things that may be true early metazoans. And I think it's a pattern that we see throughout the geological record. There's nothing very strange about it, because the mammals, for example, existed throughout the Mesozoic, but they weren't very obvious until the dinosaurs disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous, and then the mammals radiated. And we see this with our brachiopods as well, that groups that are there in the Ordovicians, such as the Pentamerids and the Spiriferids and Atropids, they're not so common until a lot of the major Ordovician groups, the Orthids and Strophonids, die out at the end of the Ordovician, and then they radiate. So I don't think it's so strange that within this grouping we do have some metazoans, and at the start of the Cambrian, or possibly before, these are the groups that then go on to diversify and radiate when this rather odd group of organisms, the Ediacara animals, actually disappear. But I think it's important to realize that the Ediacara biota, whatever they are, if they're animals or if they're protozoans or whatever, they were the main show in town during the latest Precambrian. They were the ecosystem at that particular time, and they would have developed a sort of seascape rather like this. There weren't any major groups of shelly organisms that were there to actually dominate the seascape. And as far as we know, they're dominated by these sort of suspension-feeding organisms, no predators, scavengers, those sorts of things. So a rather simple but extremely extremely widespread ecosystem that existed for many tens of millions of years. So there was nothing wrong with it. It functioned extremely well and operated extremely well. Okay, well, I'll just finish with this diagram because this is an old diagram by Forty and Cooper from a number of years ago. And okay, a lot's happened since this, but I've just shown it because here they have a phylogenetic tree, a rather complex one, showing the sort of main groupings of metazoans here. But they stick the Ediacara animals over here, okay, as a sort of sister group to the metazoans. And I think Seilacher would really like this. I think that's the sort of model that he would prefer. But I would say that quite a number of people consider that the Ediacara animals, if they are animals, are actually spread out across being stem groups or even crown groups to a lot of these different metazoan plates. So there's by no means agreement that the Ediacara animals are aliens that should sit out here as a sister group to everything else. Well, next time what we're going to try and do is look at the origins of the metazoans and how far back we can find evidence for the actual true metazoans that make up this particular tree of life. So that's going to be our challenge next time, and I hope most of you can come back. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. It's helpful. Very interesting.